Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 297, King Robert Dudley. The first evidence that Queen Elizabeth was becoming emotionally involved with Robert Dudley appears in a dispatch from the Imperial Ambassador to King Philip dated the 18th of April, 1559. He writes as follows, quote, "During the last few days, Lord Robert has come so much into favor that he does whatever he likes with affairs. It is even said that Her Majesty visits him in his chamber day and night. People talk of this so freely that they go so far as to say that his wife has a malady in one of her breasts, and that the Queen is only waiting for her to die to marry Lord Robert. I can assure your Majesty that matters have reached such a pass that I have been brought to consider whether it would be well to approach Lord Robert on your Majesty's behalf, promising your help and favor, and come to terms with him." End quote. It is essential that Dudley be made to see the advantages of a continuing friendship to England and Spain, the ambassador goes on to sort of summarize his letter. Others, too, saw what was going on between the Queen and the Master of Horse, and gossip was soon spreading throughout the courts of Europe. The Venetian ambassador to the court of Philip II reported to the Doge there and the Senate, quote, "Dudley is a very handsome young man, towards whom in various ways the Queen evinces such affection and inclination that many persons believe that, if his wife, who has been ailing for some time, were perchance to die, the Queen might easily take him for a husband." End quote. Another observed, quote, "My Lord Dudley is in great favor and very intimate with Her Majesty. On this subject, I ought to report the opinion of many, but I doubt whether my letters may not miscarry or be read. Wherefore, it is better to keep silence than to speak ill." End quote. Already, Elizabeth, we know, was consulting Dudley on state affairs, and there are indications that he had influenced her to stand her ground against the bishops during the discussions that had preceded recent religious legislation. Certainly, he was instrumental in the advancement of no less than 27 of the higher clergy during the early years of her reign. And of course, the Spanish ambassador still held out hope for a Habsburg match, but he was becoming more and more pessimistic. Now, in some ways, it was only natural that Elizabeth and Dudley would grow closer together. They were together most days and spent significant time together at courtly entertainments. Other than William Cecil, no other male spent more time with the Queen. She openly danced spirited ballads with him. When it came to Dudley, for someone who normally set such a high value on the opinion of her people, Elizabeth did not seem to care what her people thought of her relationship with her favorite. On April 23rd, the first St. George's Day she celebrated as Queen, Elizabeth bestowed the Order of the Garter upon Dudley, and upon 3 senior peers of the realm, the Duke of Norfolk, who was actually Dudley's great rival, the Marquess of Northampton, and the Earl of Rutland. This caused bad feelings. The 3 other noblemen had for years served their country in various capacities, while Dudley, on the other hand, was the son and grandson of traitors. His only qualification for the honor were good looks and superb horsemanship. Before long, Dudley was doling out his own favors obtained from the Queen and building his own power base within court. But don't get me wrong, however, this wasn't all Machiavellian behavior on the part of Robert Dudley. He clearly had strong feelings for Elizabeth. Dudley's letters to the Queen are all warm and deeply sincere. One of Elizabeth's nickname for Dudley, for of course she had multiple, was that he was her eyes. But truly for Elizabeth, Dudley offered her one supreme advantage compared to all her other suitors. He could not marry her. Dudley, as I mentioned, was already married. His wife, however, lived in the countryside, and he saw her only infrequently. Thus, Dudley could spend all his time with Elizabeth, and she never had to worry about a marriage proposal. We cannot be sure whether Dudley ever truly entertained the idea of marrying Elizabeth. Personally, I think he'd have to have been insane not to have at least thought about it. His wife, as the different ambassadors alluded to before, was often ill. But again, we can't say for certain. On the 2nd of July, Elizabeth retired to her residency at Greenwich for some leisure time and entertainment. That's where she was when word reached England from France that King Henry II had suffered a serious wound in a jousting match. Word arrived the next day that the French monarch had died. This event had potentially major repercussions for Elizabeth. While Henry had touted Mary, Queen of Scots, as the rightful Queen of England, he had always been too much of a realist to jeopardize the fragile peace between the two kingdoms on the chance that he might prevail in an attempted coup. His son, Francis II, was a child. The regency would be run by Catherine de' Medici and the ultra-Catholic Guise family. Who knew what they would do? The English government feared that a two-pronged attack on England might be attempted by the French and the Scots, who were supposed allies. Although their friendship had become a little strained of recent times, that might not necessarily be to England's advantage. There were French troops in Scotland, and if they gained the upper hand there, they might decide to invade England from the north. What Elizabeth's advisors could not foresee, however, was that France would soon be so torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and the Huguenots, they're the French Protestants, and that's a story we're going to be getting into very soon here, that she would have little time to make war on England. Nor would the Scots be likely to support it, because many were in sympathy with the Huguenots and distrusted the Catholics who were in power in France. For the moment, though, the Queen was sufficiently worried about her vulnerable situation to reconsider her position on marriage. If she could make mischief for the French and keep them occupied, as she would, and when she heard of Francis II had boasted that he would have himself proclaimed the King of England, she loudly declared, quote, "I will take a husband who will give the King of France some trouble and do him more harm than he expects," end quote. The man that she had in mind was a thorn in the side of the French. His name was James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, and had been thought of as a husband for Elizabeth as far back as 1543 by none other than Henry VIII. Until Mary Stuart bore a child, Arran was the heir to the Scottish throne, and the Protestant lords in Scotland were in favor of a match between him and Elizabeth, since both were chief upholders of God's religion, in the Scots word, and their marriage would unite England and Scotland. Arran was more than willing to follow the plan. Until recently, he had been a refugee in Switzerland, having fled there from the French, who feared the threat that he posed to Mary Stuart's throne. At the beginning of July, Elizabeth had organized his escape, sending a regent, Thomas Randolph, an expert on Scottish affairs actually, with instructions to smuggle him secretly to England, disguised as a merchant. Soon, people were beginning to openly wonder whether Arran might be in England, and the imperial ambassador was in the daily expectation of an announcement of the Queen's betrothal to the Earl, whom he believed was a little more than just a guest. Now, in fact, what we know and what they didn't know is that Elizabeth was using her rumored interest in Arran as merely a weapon against the French, and he actually didn't arrive in London until the end of August. What Elizabeth was really after here was support. She wanted the support of either the Emperor or King Philip in the event of a French invasion. So, to that end, she revived the marriage negotiations and sought to draw them out as long as possible. Elizabeth spent that summer on Progress, a tour of the realm. English monarchs did these every summer unless the plague intervened. It gave them a chance to see their kingdom and, crucially, for their subjects to see them. But it was during this particular summer Progress that Elizabeth and Dudley grew even closer, a fact which only intensified the feelings of envy already simmering within the Privy Council. No one wanted to see Dudley, the son of a traitor, become the next King of England, least of all Cecil, who resented Dudley with the passion of 1,000 suns. To Dudley's credit, his loyalty to Elizabeth was without question. That being said, he certainly realized that, should she marry, his influence would plummet. Hence, whenever possible, he slandered his various rivals for the Queen's time and affection. In her letters, Elizabeth also referred to Dudley as her bonny, sweet Robin. Throughout that summer, the rumors that the two were engaged in a more physical affair reached a crescendo. Back in Augsburg, the Emperor frantically wrote to his ambassador in England to determine if there was any truth to the rumors. The ambassador reported back, quote, "I have employed as my agent a certain Francis Borth, who is on very friendly terms with the ladies of the bedchamber and all other persons who have been about the Queen and have brought her up since childhood. They all swear by all that is her holy majesty has most certainly never been forgetful of her honor. Yet it is not without significance that her majesty shows her liking for Lord Robert more markedly than is consistent with her reputation and dignity." End quote. No matter how much she protested that she had no time for love, the fact remained that the Queen looked, at least outwardly so, to be falling in love with her master of horse. On the 28th of April, the Earl of Arran secretly arrived in London and was smuggled into Cecil's house at Westminster, where he was to stay. On the following day, he was granted a private audience with the Queen at Hampton Court, and 2 days later left for Scotland, escorted by Thomas Randolph. The plan was that he should lead the rebel Protestant lords against the Queen's regent government, and thus divert the Scots and French from turning their ambitious eyes toward England. All talk of a marriage alliance with Elizabeth had been abandoned, as she was evidently not impressed by the Earl personally. Arran's story, sadly, was to end in tragedy. He became insane and never got to enjoy the power and prestige that might have been his birthright. But none of that mattered. It now appeared that the only foreign contender for the Queen's hand with any chance of success was the Archduke Charles. Now, much of this I will not go into because it's just way too detailed for this show. But suffice it to say that by early October, the imperial ambassador had become absolutely convinced that Elizabeth would marry the Archduke Charles, despite Elizabeth herself committing to no such thing. Hence, by the autumn of 1559, he was writing back to the emperor, telling him to send his son to England without delay. Things then became problematic for Dudley, because he was seen as the reason a match with a powerful ally had not already been concluded. Elizabeth recognized this reality as well, and so did her best to encourage her various suitors by making it clear she would marry no one, Dudley included. The Queen and the imperial ambassador continued their heated and often confused, and I do mean super confusing, marital negotiations. The imperial ambassador, at one point, told Elizabeth that Charles was on a ship already on his way to marry her. Elizabeth took offense at this, angrily telling him that she had never agreed to marry Charles, that she had only agreed for him to come to England so that they could get to know each other. Exasperated, the ambassador then declared that, if such were the case, it might be better for him not to come at all. Spoiler alert, he wasn't coming and had never left Austria. And frankly, this whole episode would be comical if it weren't for the fact that thousands of people could potentially lose their lives in a war fermented by all this idiotic confusion. Now, while all this was going on, Dudley continued to build his own power base. In November, he was appointed as the Lord Constable of Windsor Castle and doled out many of the lesser roles there to his supporters. But Dudley was actively doing something else all the while. He had now begun to style himself as the champion of Protestant England. He promoted Protestant interest within the Privy Council. He even did his best to set England on a course of conflict with the Catholic Habsburgs. It was on his advice that Elizabeth sent a squadron of ships to support the Protestant Scottish lords in their civil war against Scotland's Catholic regent, the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. Dudley seems to have recognized that he was becoming the envy of all and as a result unpopular. He needed a source of legitimacy. He found one in the Protestant cause. In December of 1559, the imperial ambassador finally gave up and left England, realizing he had failed in his efforts to court Elizabeth. But that did not mean that the door was open for Dudley. The same ambassador reported back to the emperor in January 1560 that the English court was gearing up for a fight. Anti-Dudley feeling was at an all-time high. According to some, by March he was already boasting that, quote, if he lives another year, he will be in a very different position from now, end quote. Yet all the accusations seems to have been baseless. Dudley never took any actions to have his present marriage dissolved. Early in the new year, the imperial ambassador returned once more to England in an attempt to revive the Habsburg marriage negotiations. The King of Bohemia and the Duke of Bavaria, both vassals of the emperor, sent envoys urging the Queen to reconsider and suggested to Charles that it might be better if he went and did his courting in person. But the emperor, deeply offended by Elizabeth's apparent indifference to this match, was now refusing to let his son go to England unless she made some commitment beforehand. Thus, the two sides had reached a stalemate. And by February it was obvious that the marriage negotiations had, once again, collapsed. On the 19th, the ambassador gave his opinion that the Queen's strategies would lead to her ruin, because without the support and friendship of the Habsburg monarchies, quote, not only will the French despise her, but her own people as well, and she will be left helpless, end quote. Of course, the question on everybody's minds was, did Elizabeth care? Or did she only want the way cleared to marry Robert Dudley? In February 1560, affairs in Scotland grew more serious. The English reached an agreement with the rebellious Protestant Scottish lords that Elizabeth would take Scotland under her protection, so long as the rightful queen, then Mary, Queen of Scots, remained in France. This would allow said lords to use English military firepower to, ideally, drive out the present regent, Mary Guise. Remember, of course, the Guise family were ultra-Catholic. The English attempted to blockade Scotland to prevent French military aid from arriving. Mary Guise responded by launching an attack at Leith, in which the English were soundly beaten. As a result, Elizabeth became persona non grata in Paris. There were even rumors that the French wanted to have her poisoned, rumors that William Cecil believed. At the same time, Pope Pius IV sent a letter to Elizabeth entreating her to return to the Catholic fold. It never reached her. Elizabeth would not let the messenger bearing it cross the English Channel. For the rest of her life, in fact, she would turn a deaf ear to pleas from Rome. Then, on June 11th, Mary Guise died of a protracted illness. The French signified to England that they were tired of all the conflict and ready for peace. Elizabeth dispatched Cecil to Scotland to negotiate a treaty. Now, to be fair, Cecil didn't want to leave. He feared Elizabeth was deliberately sending him to Edinburgh to get him out of the way, so that Dudley could replace all his ministers with his own men. But in the end, with little recourse, Cecil left for Scotland. On July 2nd, 1560, the war with Scotland was brought to an end by the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh. For Cecil, this was a diplomatic triumph, achieved after weeks of bargaining. Under the terms of the treaty, the French agreed to withdraw from Scotland, leaving the government of that kingdom in the hands of the Scottish Council, with the English and French undertaking not to interfere. In the name of Queen Mary, the French commissioners promised that she would renounce all claims to Elizabeth's throne and would cease to quarter the royal arms of England with her own. At last, the French had agreed to recognize Elizabeth as Queen of England. It did seem that a true foundation for peace had finally arrived. The threat of war removed. More importantly, Elizabeth's prestige had been much enhanced in the eyes of Europe. Cecil was satisfied with what he had achieved. Yet, Elizabeth was not. In a series of letters to Edinburgh, she castigated her minister for not having secured the return of Calais, or for not forcing the French to reimburse the money she had spent fighting them in Scotland. Cecil's happiness soon faded. He believed that Robert Dudley was behind her complaints, and that he was out to discredit him. This might have been the case, but equally well, Elizabeth had been pessimistic about the outcome of Cecil's mission, and may have been put out at being proved wrong. At the end of July, Elizabeth left London for her summer progress once more. At the end of nearly every day, Elizabeth and Dudley rode together or hunted. Elizabeth no longer flirted with other men. All her attention was directed toward Dudley, much to the ire of everyone else at court. When Cecil returned to court later that July, he found the Queen distant and cool. Whatever his concerns had been before leaving, the situation upon his return was far worse than even his most pessimistic expectations. The Queen was practically treating Dudley as her husband, and now had no time for her once most trusted advisor. The world had turned upside down. The council was despondent. Everyone expected that the Queen would now marry Dudley, ending any hope of an alliance with a European power. In August, the Scottish Parliament abolished the authority of Rome and adopted Calvinism as its official religion. The goal was now to broker a marriage deal between Elizabeth and the Earl of Arran, no matter how unlikely that exigency now seemed. Scotland wanted to unite with England, forming the most powerful Protestant kingdom in Europe. Scotland wanted to unite with England, forming the most powerful Protestant kingdom in Europe. But if the news from the English court was true, then there was absolutely no chance of that happening. Now, Dudley and his wife, remember, he's married, had now been married for 8 years, but they rarely saw each other. We know very little about Amy Dudley, or how the rumors surrounding her and the Queen impacted her. We know that the two had no children, nor is there any evidence that Amy Dudley was ever pregnant. We do have evidence from 2 sources that Amy was very depressed throughout September 1560. We can only guess at the cause. There were persistent rumors that Amy was in poor physical health as well. Some scholars have speculated that she had breast cancer. Elizabeth herself reported to an ambassador on her 27th birthday on the 6th of September that Amy Dudley was either dead or very near death. All the while, William Cecil continued to contemplate his position, assuming that he would need to resign very soon. However, he calmly noted at the time that even should Amy Dudley die, her husband would never be able to marry the Queen. The answer was simple. The public outcry would simply be too great. Everyone in England would assume that Dudley had murdered his wife, even if he hadn't. And so it was that, ironically, the one exigency that would make him able to marry Elizabeth and become king would simultaneously preclude the same action. And then something truly shocking happened. What was traditionally known as Our Lady's Fair opened at Abingdon in England on Sunday, the 8th of September, and Amy Dudley, in her residency, gave all her servants permission to go. Indeed, she seemed unduly anxious that they should go, for when some protested that it wasn't fitting to attend a fair on a Sunday, she insisted they obey her order. Nevertheless, there were a few that remained stubborn, declaring it was unseemly for her to go to a place where they might have to rub shoulders with servants of lesser-bred persons. The same servant reasoned with her that if she went to the fair, there would be no one left at home at all with Amy to dine with her. Amy responded angrily that she could do as she pleased. This particular servant retired, and the rest went off to the fair. At around 11 a.m., Amy Dudley took her dinner, but otherwise the entire household was quiet, most of the servants having gone, and everyone seems to have kept to their rooms or quarters. But then, when her servants returned from the fair late that afternoon, they were shocked and bewildered to find Amy Dudley's body at the foot of a shallow flight of stone steps that led from her rooms to the hall. Her neck had been broken. The author of a later report asserted, much later on, that her headdress and her clothing were still in place and not disarranged, but this information appears nowhere in other contemporary records. The same author refers to the body being discovered at the foot of a pair of stairs, i.e., a staircase likely with a landing in the middle, which corroborates contemporary accounts. One day later, on September the 9th, a hurried messenger reached court and informed Elizabeth Ann Dudley what had transpired. They were both utterly shocked. That very evening, Dudley wrote the following letter home. Quote, "The greatness and suddenness of the misfortune doth so perplex me, until I do hear from you," he's writing to one of his servants, "how the matter standeth, or how this evil should light upon me, considering what the malicious world will brew it, I can take no rest. And because I have no way to purge myself of the malicious talk that I know the wicked world will use, but one which is the very plain truth to be known, I do pray you, as you have loved me, and do tender me my quietness, and as now my special trust is in you, that you will use all the devices and means you can possibly have for learning of the truth, wherein have no respect for any living person." End quote. In other words, what Dudley wanted was an inquest carried out as to the cause of his wife's death, and he wanted it carried out in secret. 2 days later, Elizabeth ordered the news of Amy's death to be made public. She knew the reaction would be swift and negative. She did her best to avoid the public in the weeks after Amy Dudley's death. Meanwhile, the inquest went ahead, but simultaneously went nowhere. The servants could merely report what they had found. Some made vague references to suicide, though the objective evidence certainly wouldn't have supported that conclusion. Dudley, we know from his personal journals, was frankly shocked and devastated at the death of his wife. And honestly, not because he really cared for Amy. Rather, he was concerned that Elizabeth would now refuse to see him, given that the conclusion as to why Amy had died would be plain for all to see. It was one thing for the Queen to consort with a married man. It was quite another to consort with a man suspected of now killing his wife so he could marry her. William Cecil, out of political intrigue or genuine concern, I'm not sure, wrote to Dudley to offer his condolences. And we do know that Dudley was quite touched by his show of solidarity. Finally, on September the 13th, the inquest drew to a close. The coroner could find no quote-unquote presumptions of evil. Ultimately, the matter was ruled an accidental death. Dudley had hoped for more. He had hoped for evidence of murder that would clear his name. In vain, he pressed for another inquest. Truth be told, many in the kingdom were far from certain as to Dudley's innocence. The feeling persisted even after Dudley arranged a lavish funeral for his late wife. But how did Amy Dudley really meet her death? There is no dispute that she died of a broken neck. She was found at the bottom of the staircase, and the obvious conclusion would be that she had fallen down those stairs, and that her death was due, as Dudley's supporters asserted, to an accident. Yet it was claimed at the time that the steps were far too shallow to have caused a fatal injury, and this led many people to deduce that someone broke her neck and then placed her body at the foot of the stairs to make it look like it has been an accident. Her husband, as we know, was the chief suspect. Many openly accused Dudley of the murder, alleging that he had hired an assassin to do the deeds. And the name of this man, according to many, was Richard Verney. Verney was a nephew of one of the servants and had once been Dudley's page and was staunchly loyal to him. In fact, one asserted that Verney was simply his to be commanded. He remained with Amy that day, September 8th, alone. Again, this is according to the assertions of some. And we should point out, Verney, rather conveniently, died himself shortly thereafter in London. It's almost like a sort of JFK scenario. Of course, it's impossible to check many of the details in this account since many are just so incredibly vague. Verney's movements and whereabouts on the 8th of September cannot be traced with any degree of certainty at all. The only contemporary mention of him in connection with Dudley dates from the previous April, when the latter sent for Verney and Verney had to write to apologize for not being able to come. Now, it is, of course, possible that Verney's aunt, also a servant, was in on the murder plot. It was she who was the sole servant left with Amy on that day, and she was the last recorded person to see Amy alive. Now, Amy was also, though, certainly anxious to get rid of her servants. Was this because she was expecting a secret visitor? Could that visitor perhaps have been someone sent by her husband to discuss an annulment of their marriage? Such a development had been rumored that year, and in view of the damage such rumors could do, it would have been natural for Robert to insist that Amy receive her visitor in private, perhaps with all her servants gone away. Or was it more sinister? Was Amy led to believe that such a visitor was coming when something else was planned? On the other hand, I suppose, we could also speculate that she was so depressed and possibly so ill and desperate for some peace and quiet that she simply threw herself down the stairs. Now, if Amy was murdered before being laid at the foot of the stairs, though, how was it done? There's an interesting tale. It's interesting to think about, but this Dudley residence was actually an old monastery. And according to some legends, there was actually a secret door in Amy's bedchamber that had since been essentially walled up so that we can no longer see it. But this secret door may have allowed an assassin secret entrance into the room while Amy Dudley was asleep, who breaks her neck, who then places her at the bottom of the stairs. Again, this is unbelievable conjecture, but it is a story that is related. And I kind of think the secret door in the monastery part is interesting, so that's why I told you. Now, some, of course, continued to attribute Amy's death to a suicide. I mean, we do know she had been depressed, and that would explain why she was so anxious to get her servants out of the house. No one at the time thought to attribute, though, Amy's death to natural causes. But since then, since the year 1956, in fact, a new theory has been asserted by Professor Ian Aird, one of the most modern historians to look at this case. Aird considered the possibility that Amy was suffering from breast cancer. In fact, there was a, quote, malady in one of her breasts, end quote, that had been first referred to by the imperial ambassador back in April of 1559. This disease, as it progresses, causes in about 50% of sufferers a weakening of the bones due to cancerous deposits that break away from the original tumor and are carried through the bloodstream to settle on the bones, particularly the spine, which then becomes unnaturally brittle. Thus, it follows that if Amy was in the last stages of the disease, even the slightest exertion required to walk down a flight of stairs could have caused a spontaneous fracture of her vertebrae. However, if this theory is correct, it offers absolutely no explanation of Amy's unusual behavior on the day of her death. Nor does the less commonly accepted modern theory that she suffered from an aortic aneurysm, the terminal enlargement of an artery from the heart, which causes pain and the swelling in the chest, and mental aberrations, including depression and fits of anger, resulting from the erratic blood flow to the brain. Sudden, slight pressure can cause the bursting of an aneurysm, bringing spontaneous death. The resultant could fall in Amy's case, which then would have caused her neck to break. Whether due to natural causes or not, Amy Dudley's death was certainly convenient, but not, ironically, for the person whom many expected to benefit from it. Most people believed that her husband had killed her in order to marry the queen, and thus he had a motive for doing so. Yet he, Robert Dudley, thick-skinned as he was, could not have been so stupid as to think that he'd get away with it. And if she was indeed dying of cancer, then he had nothing to do in the first place. On the day before her death, the Queen had told the Imperial Ambassador that Lady Dudley was dead, or nearly so. If Elizabeth was involved in a murder plot, she was hardly likely to announce the death of the victim before she was certain that it had happened or even refer to it. Elizabeth was far too clever for that. Yet, her announcement would make more sense if she had been told by Dudley that the end was near. The behavior of the Queen and Dudley after the event strongly suggested they were both shocked and bewildered by the news, and both did their utmost to ensure that Amy's death was thoroughly and objectively investigated. If Dudley did murder his wife, then he did it about the stupidest way possible. To get away with it, Amy's death had to look like it was natural. A broken neck doesn't just normally happen. Plus, given the implications of Amy's death, it didn't give Dudley or Elizabeth the end they wanted. Elizabeth could never marry Dudley now and keep her throne. In the end, Amy Dudley's death was perhaps the final nail in the Queen's virginity. In the end, the only real beneficiary of Amy's death had been William Cecil. Once the inquest was over, he was restored to court. Frankly, if anyone had reason to murder Amy Dudley, it was William Cecil. He would have known that it would have ended the prospect of Dudley's marriage to the Queen. Moreover, it would have given him the chance to appear Dudley's friend, which he did, and which was perhaps the key reason he was readmitted to court so quickly. It would have been easy for Cecil, with his various connections, to instigate Amy's mysterious death. Now, that being said, I want to be clear that there is no direct evidence of this. Cecil had a motive, but then again, so do a lot of innocent suspects. If you've enjoyed this episode, please feel free to check out the website, or if you'd like to support the show, check out a 7-day free trial of our Patreon account. For $1 a month, you can get ad-free versions of the show that come out a week early. For $2 or more, you can get access to Western Civ 2.0, which is a reboot of the whole show beginning way back in the ancient sands of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Right now, we're deep in Roman history again, and I know that everybody loves that. So if you'd like to check out a free trial of our Punic War episodes or anything, just click the link. You can get it for free for 7 days. And as always, if you've enjoyed the show, but you don't want to make a financial contribution or click on anything else, feel free to at least give a rating or a review. It does help people find us.